Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. And with those few words, we can get to the root of black music. The church, the gospel, the blues. These are fabrics that interweave and are expressed throughout jazz. And we're reacting today to something Grant Green Feeling the Spirit, which is of course rooted deep in the gospel, and he's picking kind of Negro spirituals. But here's the elements. Here's the elements. What are we listening to here? The piano's got some bassy-esque minimalism. It's drenched in the blues and feel. And while there is some intricacy, it's not prevalent as much as pattern and space and the blues and just simple feel. And to illustrate even more what I'm talking about, I thought that might have been Horace Silver at first. I'm like, well, I don't think Silver was backing anybody by this point, 1964 or so. I'm like, so it can't be Silver. So I had to think, I'm like, I don't think it's Duke Pearson. And I'm like, I don't think it's Bobby Timmons. Who's hammering out that black blues gospel sound? And it's from a player who is a wonderful player, but we think of more as a composer and a guy driven by the egotistical side of art, talent and ability and virtuosity. Herbie Hancock. He's one of the great geniuses of modern music. But even he, for all of his talent, when reduced to playing just kind of the blues and the gospel, he plays with such a wonderful panache, such a wonderful feel, that you're back in the church. And all the complexity of arrangement and composition take a back seat to the simple element of expressing how I feel. And again, Grant Green, who is the great architect here, and we've taught Grant Green numerous times, but Grant's approach is very different on guitar compared to like a rock guitar, even a lot of jazz guitar players. There's very little chordal structure to what he does. He's very much playing single note lines like a horn player. A guitar can play 4 strings, 5 strings, 3 strings. He's limiting himself to 1 note at a time for the clarity and lack of ambiguation. He wants there to be a clear punctuation of what he's expressing, a la Charlie Parker, a la Louis Armstrong, a la Charlie Christian. I mean, the roots of expression in jazz are rooted in the blues expression of self, how I feel. And composition gets in the way of that. Ego can misinform that because it's trying to illustrate my intellect. And my intellect is a expression of me. It's a fraction of me. But my soul and my spirit are different parts of that entity. And when they speak, they come from a different place. And so when you think of Empyrean Isles, when you think of The Prisoner, Speak Like a Child, later Herbie Hancock, there's a lot of brilliant playing and composition, but it's also got a lot of angles and a lot of interesting chords and changes, and this is just simple feel. And Grant takes the first lead, of course, as Grant is known to do. This is his record, of course. I think Butch Warren, Billy Higgins are on this, along with Garvin Massou, who's a great Shakir player, I think it is called. Percussion kind of thing. Yeah, Garvin Massou. Oh, it plays tambourine, it says here. Playing tambourine. But that's the essence of gospel. You can take any instrument and chant down Babylon. And when Bob Marley spoke about chanting down Babylon, there's a reference there that's linked to marching around the walls of Jericho until those walls come down. Which is, of course, a biblical story with the great Joshua leading the children of Israel into Canaan. And for a people who live in a similar circumstance in 2 millennia, 3 millennia, 4 millennia later, the same principles exist of we're going to chant down the walls of Babylon. We're going to blow our horns at that fortress, Jericho. And somehow we're going to find freedom. And it's not something you have to fake when you live in constant strain. And the black man in America has constant strain. And so watching Hancock come in here, he's speaking the gospel. Can I get an amen? I mean, he's in the pulpit, and it's a different Hancock. To the point where I almost didn't recognize him at first, having forgotten that as a sideman, he's so fluent in all the vernacular. My wife washed my hair yesterday. It feels wonderful. Thank you, wife. It's just, it throat grabbed me and moved me listening to it the other day. I was actually at work or my brother's shop helping him out with some stuff, and this came on. So I didn't even know what it was. I recognized Grant Green pretty quickly, though. I'm like, oh, that's Grant. And I didn't look at my phone. I'm just like, who's hammering that down? Who's hammering down? It's minimal Ahmad Jamal, Count Basie-like. It's got so much feel, so much gospel. It's got repetition and pattern. And repetition and pattern are incredibly important elements of the blues, of funk, of soul and R&B, of even early rock and roll. It's pattern. And we as humans are comfortable with pattern. We love pattern. And so hearing Herbie fill those bars with the simple, the feel, there's a different side of Herbie you get to understand right here. When I listen to The Egg, which I think is a fantastic composition, it's very avant-garde. It's very modern. It's actually got some elements of its own minimalism, but it's still a very different thing in my head than I think when I'm hearing that. This is the product of art students. People contemplating the edge. Contemplating making music that's different. Trying to be unique. So there's an exercise of intellect involved with that composition. And when you just play something like this, marching around the walls of Jericho with your fellow countrymen, hollering at those walls, screaming, picking up your horns and blowing your horns. And oddly enough, there is no horns on this record. It's just, piano, guitar, bass, drums, and some percussion. And the tamborine's not much of an instrument until you put it in the hands of the black church. When you hear a tambourine played in the black church, you're like, oh. That's what the tambourine do? I didn't know the tambourine did. I mean, it's a whole lot different when you got Sister Rosetta clacking on that. She can bring down some thunder with it. And so it's an interesting way to look at this song. And it's an interesting way to look at Herbie Hancock. And it's also an interesting way to look at jazz. Jazz has vernaculars that are very varied. You don't get to say double V like that very often. Very varied. It's not very fun, actually. But, so it's just cool to hear her Hancock in this element. And it's not to say he doesn't exercise that expression later in his career. He does. But this one was just one that I'm like, I just was loving the piano. I was in my earbuds, and I was like, man. And it shocked me a little bit. Because so often when I find out it was Hancock, I'm like, oh yeah, that's the Hancock I know. And so to have it move me and stir me like this did really illustrates the side of Hancock that shows you the roots and the elements that is black music. And how anybody that's in jazz has that black background of the blues and gospel in them can always refer back to that. And it's a comfortable jacket. It's a real good fit. If the glove fits, we got to commit. And when you put that jacket of the blues and the gospel on, it's such an easy language to communicate. And because of its familiarity, because of the roots of your childhood, you grew up within that mist. The mist of the gospel. It engulfed us. I spent time in the black church as a kid. My dad built pipe organs when I was a young boy. Pipe organs, which are pretty much a thing of the past, sadly. They're a magnificent instrument. The sound they make is hallowed. It's organic and mystical and ethereal. And when you're in the presence of a pipe organ, it's not hard to feel the presence of the Lord, which is kind of how my dad ended up an evangelical. And it was some of the churches he installed them in were more of the Catholic slant in Quebec, and I think in the Carolinas. But there was also some Pentecostal and Baptist churches that we installed pipe organs in, including in D.C., including in Detroit, a church in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And so we're traveling on a school bus, installing these pipe organs around eastern half of the continent as a child. My mom taught me to read at a young age. But that exposure to the black church, I think, planted a seed in me at a very young age. And to feel the difference between the pious rigidity of an Anglican congregation or an Episcopalian event. We must be somewhat well behaved. We are in the presence of the Lord. Versus, you know what I mean? I'm hiking my skirt up, dancing. And there was, in the more Protestant, conservative Protestants, dancing to God was a replacement for sexuality. And it filled a void that they've never really been comfortable in. In the black church, that sexual dance and that spiritual dance are very interwoven. The carnal and the spiritual are a fabric that's very intertwined. And you see that throughout the documentation of black music, how the roots of the gospel in the church are always right under the surface. And Aretha Franklin, Ray Charles, Al Green, that perpetuates throughout into soul, rhythm and blues, gospel, hip hop, R&B. Even a guy like, Puff Daddy and those guys, they could reference the church. And I'm guessing a lot of those kids stay like Juice WRLD before he passed. The church was something that was still part of his ingrained background. So I just wanted to share about this great song. Again, it's a simple structure, but within that simple structure is greater expression sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. That simplicity, again, it's driving a road you've driven 1,000 times, where you know each turn and each curve and each hill without having to think about it or process it or be concerned about it. That's when your mind's the most free to wander. And your mind can drift into all kinds of scenarios driving a road you're familiar with. If you're driving a map that you don't know, a road or a route you've never been on, you got to pay more attention to those changes, those chords, those notes, those time signatures. I can't let my mind drift off into this because I got to, where's that turn? Oh, even with Siri, even with modern GPS and all that, when you have to follow coordinates and follow directions, your mind doesn't have the freedom to truly be as free as the blues allows you to be free, because it's a road you've driven your whole life. And so there's nothing freer than the blues. There's nothing freer than the gospel. And so the band, again, the whole group is just on point, comfortable, familiar territory, and Hancock's in a setting where you really get to see him shine, you know? And it's probably the most Hancock's moved me in years. And I love a lot of Herbie, don't get me wrong. And I listen to Herbie's stuff fairly frequently. I haven't listened to much of anything aside from streaming the last few months because this room's been such a mess. But we're nearing the end of all construction. We have a sink to go in today, a mop sink. A door has to be installed, a few things, but we're talking inspection soon. So excited about that. So we'll talk to you all soon. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Herbie Hancock icon without question. Y'all be safe. Stay warm. The cold's coming. It's already been a chilly few nights here in Minnesota. We're averaging 29, below freezing. And by the weekend, we're supposed to have like a high of 15. That's a cold day here. That's minus 10 in Canada in Celsius. So that's a chilly, chilly day. Minus 2, 29 degrees here in the U.S. That's good outdoor activity, walking the dog, playing some hockey weather. I was walking my dog yesterday and my nose had just enough ping in it from that chill. I'm like, man, it makes me want to skate around like a kid. Back in the good old days. Y'all be safe. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.